So after all the talk about middleware, let's now actually go ahead and create our own middleware functions. And again, remember that we actually already used middleware before. So let's take a look at that. And somewhere up here. And so you see that in order to use middleware, we used app.use. Okay, so the use method is the one that we use in order to, actually use middleware. So add middleware to our middleware stack. Okay, so this express.json here, calling this JSON method, basically returns a function. Okay, and so that function is then added to the middleware stack. And so similar to that, we can create our own middleware function. So let's do that now. And so of course, we still need to use app.use. Okay, and so now in here, all we have to do is to pass in our function that we want to add to the middleware stack. So remember from the last video that of course in each middleware function, we have access to the request and the response. Okay, but also we have the next function. And so just like this, we add it as a third argument to this middleware function. Okay, and like this, Express then knows that we are actually defining a middleware here. All right. Now, just like before, actually, we could have called this argument here something else, like x or n, or it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it's the third argument to this function. So Express basically passes the next function as the third argument into this middleware function, and we can then call it whatever we want. But again, next is really the convention in Express, and so in order to avoid confusion, we always use this name. Okay? And the same for request and response, as I mentioned before. We could call them something else, but the convention is to call them like this. Anyway, let's just log something to the console here in this middleware function, just so that we have some code to actually run each time there is a new request. So let's say hello from the middleware. And add some emoji here, again, to make it pop a little bit. I really like that. What happens here? Oh, right. So that is the code that we want to execute here. And now, just as we talked in the last video, we actually need to call the next function. Okay? And if we didn't call next here, well, then the request response cycle would really be stuck at this point. We wouldn't be able to move on, and we would never ever send back a response to the client. So I can't stress enough how important it is to never forget to use next in all of your middlewares. Okay? And it's as simple as that. All we have to do is to specify next, so this argument here, and then actually call that function like this. Okay, and with that, we are actually ready to test it out. And all we have to do is to send a simple request to our API. So here is the API. Let's close up this one here. And so it doesn't really matter because this, of course, applies to every single request. So let's go back. And indeed, we have hello from the middleware logged to our console. Okay, so great. And I wanted to quickly touch on what I just said before, which is that this middleware here applies to each and every single request. Okay, and that's because we didn't specify any route. So remember that before I said that our route handlers here are actually kind of middleware themselves. They are simply middleware functions that only apply for a certain URL, so a certain route. Okay? But these more simple middleware functions that we define up here, well, they are going to apply to every single request, at least if the route handler comes before this middleware. So let me actually show you something. And I'm going to cut it from here and now actually put it here after this route handler. So what do you think is going to happen now when I make a call to this route? So let's see what happens. So this exact route, so the one that I just showed you, let me send a request to that. And now let's go back. And now we don't have hello from the middleware. So why is that? Well, simply because this middleware, so this route handler here, it comes before this middleware function that we have here. And this route handler, which in this case is get all tours, actually ends the request response cycle. So let's take a look at that. So we have get all tours. So where is that? Yeah, so here is the function. And by sending a result with res.json, we actually end the request response cycle. And so the next middleware in the stack, which in this case is this one, so our custom one, will then not be called. Again, because the cycle has already finished, okay? So make sure to understand that this order really matters a lot in Express, okay? It's fundamental to understand that this is how Express apps work, okay? So in order to kind of test that, let's try to see what happens when we do a request to this route. So to get tour, update tour, or delete tour. So let's do this one, send a request here, and let's go back. And now we have hello from the middleware. And so that is actually what we expected, right? So that is because, of course, this middleware here now is before the route handler. And so it is, of course, part of the middleware stack that gets executed before the request response cycle ends. All right? Make sense? So let's take that back. And so usually we define this kind of global middleware here before all our route handlers. All right? So this is one very simple middleware function that we just defined to run some code, but let's actually do another one. And of course we can have as many middleware functions as we like, and this time we actually want to manipulate the request object. So the signature here is always the same, always request, response, and next. And now let's actually manipulate the request. All we want to do in this case is to add the current time to the request. So we can simply define a property on the request object called request time, and then set it to a new date, which basically translates to right now. And then we can use a very handy date function, which is called to ISO string, which will then convert it into a nice readable string for us. So let's pretend we have some route handler that really needs the information about when exactly the request happens. And so the very simple solution is to simply add something like this to a request using middleware. All right? Now don't forget, of course, to call the next middleware in the stack. Okay? So right now we have request time on our request. So we can now use some route handler here, for example, the one for getting all the tours, to simply log that for us to the console. So console.log, and it's actually request time. Okay? Or we could even send this in the response as well. Let me just test that. And let's just call this one requested at and rec.request time. That's the one. And so yeah, let's go ahead and figure this one out. So our middleware is correct, right? Yeah, so we call next when we're done. And so let's test this now. Remember, it's on get all tours. And when we go back now, or when we go up, well, it should actually be here. So what is wrong here? So you see that down here, we actually just logged a function. And yeah, of course, we didn't actually call the toISO string. So it's a method, we have to call it. So give it a save, try it again. And now we have requested at and then today's date. So perfect. That came from our middleware. So simply because we added that property to our request. Great. So I hope that with that, you made a great step forward in order to really understand how Node apps work, how middleware works, how the entire request response cycle works, because that really is going to make all the difference when you're writing your own applications.